25. My Amish husband kept the barn loft locked for 41 years. I entered it the day he died. The padlock was warm. That was the first thing I noticed. The sun had not yet climbed the silo. The grass against my apron was still wet, and the iron under my thumb held a warmth that did not belong to a morning in late October. My husband had been in the ground for 19 hours. Key was in my apron pocket. I had not yet decided if I was allowed to use it. Somewhere above me, a single barn swallow circled the loft window and would not settle. What I am about to tell you, I have never said aloud to another living soul. Not in 41 years. My name is Mary, and this small place on the internet is where I tell the stories I kept folded inside my apron for most of my life. If you have ever stood outside a closed door in your own house and felt you were not allowed to ask, sit with me tonight. Subscribe quietly, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from. I read every name. The barn smelled the way it always smelled. Hay, old leather, iron tang of horseshoes hung on the south wall. Amos had built that wall in the second year of our marriage, when I was 26 and still believed I knew the shape of the man I had married. I was 73 now. My hands were colder than the padlock. I stood there a long minute, not moving. The swallow above me made one slow circle, then another. I counted to 11 before I understood I was counting at all. 11 was the number I had stopped saying in 1984. In our district, a wife did not ask after her husband's quiet places. That was not a rule the bishop wrote down. It was the air we breathed. We had a word for it, Gelassenheit, which the English sometimes translate as yielding, though yielding is too soft a word for what it asks. It is the daily shape of a marriage in the plain way. You fold yourself the way you fold a sheet, corner to corner, until the edges meet without complaint. I had folded for 47 years. I had folded so long I no longer felt the crease, and still that morning, the key warm against my hip, I could not make my hand turn it. The first time I touched that padlock was in the spring of 1985. I was 34. I had a basket of mending on my arm, a torn shirt of Amos that needed a patch at the elbow, and I had climbed 3 rungs of the ladder before I heard his boots cross the barn floor behind me. He did not raise his voice. He never did. His hand came around my wrist, and I remember thinking, even then, how gentle it was. Almost trembling, he said 3 words. Not up there. That was all. I climbed back down, and he pressed his thumb against the iron the way a man presses a wound to keep it closed, and he walked out into the field without looking back. I did not ask why. That is the part I want you to hear. I did not ask, not that night at supper, not the next morning over the wood stove, not in any of the 41 springs that followed. I told myself a wife who asks is a wife who does not trust. I told myself 100 small stories to cover the one large question. And the padlock stayed where it was, year after year, while I kneaded bread and stitched quilts and raised 4 sons and buried my mother and watched my hair go from chestnut to gray to the soft white of a barn owl's belly. There was a woman 2 farms over named Sarah Byler. We had been girls together, sat side by side at the singings when we were both 17. Sarah's husband Jonas passed in the winter of her 67th year. The night of the viewing, after the last of the neighbors had gone home with their casseroles, Sarah opened the bottom drawer of Jonas's bureau for the first time. She told me, weeks later, what she found inside. A small tied bundle of his mother's hair, gray and brittle, wrapped in the handkerchief his mother had been buried in. Jonas had carried his mother for 30 years inside a drawer, and Sarah had never known. I remember nodding at her over the tea. I remember thinking, men keep what they cannot say. I did not know yet that Amos was the same kind of man. I knew the sound of his climb. I want you to understand that. Across 41 years, I knew the exact weight of his boot on the 3rd rung, one that creaked because the nail had gone soft. He climbed alone after the stillborn calf in the spring of 1989. 17 minutes. He climbed alone after his brother Eli's stroke in 2002. 23 minutes. He climbed alone the night the bishop came to our kitchen in 2011 about something neither of us ever spoke of after the door closed. 51 minutes, that one. I would lie in our bed and listen for his return, and when he came down, he would wash his hands at the pump and come to bed and pray and turn out the lamp, and the loft would not be mentioned. I want to tell you what I told myself in all those years. I told myself the loft was where he kept his quiet. Every man needs a quiet place. Ordnung does not give a man many of them, so I let him have that one. I told myself it was almost holy, the way I left it alone. And maybe it was. There is a kind of leaving alone that is love, and there is a kind of leaving alone that is fear. And I have lived long enough now to know that a woman cannot always tell which one she is doing while she is doing it. I had been a wife for 47 years. I had been a widow for one day. The first felt longer. The swallow above me finally landed. It chose the narrow ledge outside the loft window and folded its wings, the way a small living thing folds itself when it has decided to stay. I took the key from my apron pocket. The metal was cooled against my palm. I did not turn it yet. I held it there, looking up at the dark wood of the door, and the warm padlock under my other thumb, and the bird on the ledge that had finally decided. 41 years, 19 hours, 1 key. I drew in a breath that did not seem to belong to my own chest, and I lifted my hand toward the iron. Key turned. 3 rusty clicks, slow as a clock that had forgotten the hour. The padlock dropped open in my palm, and I was surprised by how light it felt. I had carried heavier things in my apron pocket: sewing scissors, a wooden spoon, a folded letter from a son who had moved to Ohio, and yet this iron, which had stood between me and a room in my own home for 41 years, weighed almost nothing once it was open. I slipped it into my pocket. I set my foot on the first rung. Wood took my weight the way it had taken his 10,000 times before me. I climbed 11 rungs. I counted them this time on purpose. The loft smelled of cedar and dust and the faint sweetness of old pine sap. A single shaft of east light came through the small window where the swallow had settled, and the dust moved through it the way snow moves through a lantern beam on a still night. I expected, I think, to find something terrible. I had braced my heart for letters from another woman, or money hidden from the bishop, some object that would rewrite the man I had washed shirts for across half a century. I found none of those things. I found a cradle. It was small, and it was hand-carved, and the wood was a soft maple I recognized from the stand of trees Amos had cleared the second winter of our marriage. The rockers were worn smooth on one side, the way a thing wears when one hand rocks it many evenings in a row. Beside it, folded with the particular care a man uses for what he cannot bear to wrinkle, was a baby quilt in the double wedding pattern I had stitched in the second month of 1984. I had thought that quilt was buried with our daughter. I sat down on the loft floor without deciding to. My knees simply gave. Beside the quilt was a tin box, the kind that had once held coffee. I lifted the lid. Inside were 41 letters, each one folded in thirds, each one written in his careful, slow hand. Top one had a date from this past April. I lifted it out, and my fingers did not shake, which surprised me, because the rest of me was shaking. The letter began the same way they all began. To Eliza, our daughter, who would have been 41 this April. I hope heaven has barn swallows. I read it twice, then I set it down on my lap and I said her name out loud for the first time since the small grave was closed in 1984. Eliza. 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 3 times, the way a woman says a name she has been carrying inside her teeth for half her life. She had lived 11 days. That is all I will say about that part, because that part belongs to her and to God and to no one else. What I will tell you is that in our district, in those years, a baby who lived only 11 days was folded back into God's will quickly. There was a small service. There was a small stone. There was a sermon about the wisdom of the Almighty. And there was a hot meal brought by the women. And by the end of the month, no one spoke her name in front of me anymore. I thought Amos had folded her away the way the rest of them had. I thought he had laid her down with the quilt and walked out of the room. I sat on that loft floor with 41 letters in my lap, and I understood that he had not. He had been carrying her too. He had just been carrying her up a ladder, where no one could see. Things are true. I want you to hear me carefully here. Our people gave us a faith that has held me through winters no English heart could imagine, and that same faith did not give my husband a room in which to be a father to a daughter who had died. A man can be obedient with his mouth and disobedient with his hands, and what Amos carved in that loft was 41 years of fatherhood. Our church gave him no place to practice. I had been angry in small ways I never named, that he never spoke of her. I had eaten that anger across 41 suppers a year, salted and quiet, and I never once asked him why. I also did not speak. I also folded. Silence in our marriage was not his alone. It was a quilt we stitched together, one stitch at his side, one stitch at mine, until the pattern was so familiar we forgot we had ever made it. If there has ever been a door in your own house you were not permitted to open, tell me in one line in the comments what you found on the other side, or what you have spent years imagining you might find. I read everyone. I will not answer them all, because some things only need to be set down in writing once for a woman to feel less alone in her own kitchen. That is what this small place is for. A door gently opened between women who have stood outside other doors for too long. You, listening tonight, with your tea gone cold in your hand and the lamp low beside you, I want to leave you with one thing. If there is someone in your life who has gone quiet around a grief, do not mistake the quiet for not caring. Some sorrows are too large for the rooms a person has been given, and so they are carried up into lofts and folded into drawers and stitched into the lining of a coat that never comes off. Sometimes the loudest love is the one that builds a small cradle in a barn and locks the door so no one has to watch it rock. The man you thought was silent may have been speaking. You may simply have been on the wrong side of the door. I climbed back down the 11 rungs at sunset. The swallow was still on the ledge, and it did not move when I passed beneath it, the way a small thing does not move when it has decided that a place is finally safe. I walked into the barn, and I laid the iron padlock open on Amos's workbench beside the chisel he had used for the cradle. I did not close it. I will never close it again. A heart is meant to be left open at the end, the way a door is left open, the way a window is left open in the spring, when there is no longer anything inside that needs hiding.